Welcome, Your Excellency, Ms. Sidhu. It's a pleasure to have you here on our campus. To initiate the dialogue, since we are in an educational setting, I'd like to begin by asking you how you see the climate for academic collaborations and educational collaborations between Australia and India.
Well, hello, Vibha. I'm so delighted to be here with you today. That's a very good question. I think, if anything, the climate for Australia-India education collaboration is the best it has ever been. I think Indians are starting to understand just how excellent Australian education is. After all, we have 7 universities in the QS Top 100 rankings, which is a remarkable achievement for a country of only 24 million people. So we've really got high quality education. We're seeing more and more Indian students travelling to Australia to study. But pleasingly, we are seeing a lot more collaboration between Australian universities and Indian universities. And of course, Centurion is a perfect example of the kinds of collaborations we see with high quality Australian universities like Deakin or Charles Darwin. There's a lot of scope, there are a lot of commonalities between us and a lot of scope for collaboration.
And specifically the vocational and skill education sector, which has inspired our founders. What are your thoughts on that? Because the TAFE system in Australia is world-renowned, and justly so.
Yeah, you're exactly right. We have, I think, one of these unique skilling programs in Australia where we really recognise that so much of what you learn happens on the job. That theory will only take you so far if you really want to do the best job you can. And so we've built our model, our TAFE model, around blending theoretical training with hands-on, on-the-job training. And so that means that when someone emerges with a skill qualification, they are highly skilled and they can deal with any situation they find because they have practiced those in real time, in a real place. So I think that's the one thing that's very much impressed me about the approach that Centurion University has taken. It feels very familiar to me as a way of skilling. And I think it's a genuine model because you know that people come out with genuine skills that they can build on through life, and it's in their hands as well as in their heads, you know.
Yes, and to foster livelihoods. And just to segue from that, as you know, at our university, one of our central thrust areas is to be able to reach out to the marginal sections, the disadvantaged people of our society, the young men and women from our rural and tribal areas. Odisha has the highest tribal population in our country. And I was thinking the situation of the Aborigine community in Australia and the indigenous knowledge systems of the groups between in the two countries. What are your thoughts on the ways in which our indigenous knowledge systems could pave the way for further mutually reinforcing understanding and knowledge about issues surrounding indigenous groups?
I think I can't speak for the Odisha indigenous groups, but can I just give an illustration from the Australian indigenous experience? Like I think in most parts of the world, our indigenous population faces many challenges. Many of them live in remote parts of Australia which are very thinly populated. They don't have the same access to education and health services as the rest of the population. And so our government's tried to find ways to what we call close the gap between the indigenous population and the rest of the population. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things we can learn. Some years ago, I worked on climate change issues and environmental protection. Now, if there's anybody who knows how to protect an environment as unique and and special as Australia's. You know, we have a very particular landscape. It is, in fact, the Indigenous people who are connected to the land. And we discovered that, in fact, they manage bushfires and fires very well through a series of controlled burnings that has actually been traditional, and that has also manages the loss of emissions into the atmosphere. That is now part of how the Australian government manages land use emissions in our formal climate change management processes. So there are many things, I think, that if we stop and listen and look, actually we find that Indigenous people have solved these problems much before we have, and we can learn from them. The trick is to look and to listen and to learn.
Thank you. And I think there's so much robustness in their practices that we can derive from, you know, culturally and in the area of medicine and climate change, as you said.
Yeah, there are many areas in India. I suspect traditional medicines, traditional herbs, the use of those things, I think, become very important.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm glad to see there's a resurgence of interest in, you know, exploring these issues further and giving them due, because historically sometimes the Indigenous and the marginal communities can get disenfranchised through development or modern mainstreaming, and it's important to be sympathetic and academically engaged rigorously.
We've gone through a process in Australia of actually bringing value to Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous art and Indigenous culture, that by helping our wider community understand the meaning behind that art and culture and knowledge, we've grown to appreciate it more and to value it more. So we do that even with Aboriginal art, for example, to really explain it to people, the quality and the value of the art that people, the price, for example, that they're prepared to pay for Aboriginal art now is much higher because it is now esteemed and valued in our community. And that's, I think, the process that both our countries are going through with our Indigenous people.
Yes. Just to segue from that, a little tangentially, as a member of a very multiculturally diverse country such as Australia, and the fact that you are of Indian origin, it would be very interesting to get your comments and thoughts on how it has been for you as possibly the daughter of immigrants and as a woman having risen through the ranks and, you know, having accomplished your aspirations in the country of now your
heritage,
where you live.
Yeah, that's right. It's a very unusual experience for me to represent my country, Australia, in India, which is the country of my ancestry. And it's become a very welcome experience. I feel very comfortable here. But it's for me, it really highlights just what Australian multiculturalism is about. We are a country that has people from over 200 different backgrounds. We have the whole world in Australia, and we all have learned to live with each other and side by side. I mean, it's never been entirely perfect, but it never would be with such diversity. But I think it is as good as you could ever imagine in the world. It's a real model for how people of different cultures can come together and live together. And in our Foreign Service, I think we're starting to recognise this more. When I joined our Foreign Service, you had to have had a university degree in another language before it was recognised as having a language. Now we value our people who come with what we call community languages, the kinds of languages you grow up with because your mother and your grandmother speak it rather than because you got a degree in it, because we see that diversity very much as our strength. And it's my view, and I think it's the view of my government too, that if you're going to send diplomats overseas, they have to look like the Australian population. You know, a quarter of Australia's population is of non-European background. You know, Indians are now the fastest growing migration group in Australia and are becoming very visible in our community. So for me, the experience is a bit of a mixed one in really representing my country as I am, and being a bit with a foot in each camp,
Yes,
you know?
I'm saying you straddle both worlds.
I seriously do. And so if my job as a diplomat is to interpret India to Australia and to interpret Australia to India, for the first time in my life, I'm uniquely placed to do both those things. So it's been a real privilege. I think we're doing a lot better on women in diplomacy now. We have, for the first time in our history, a female foreign minister, a female foreign secretary, and I think we've just cracked more than half of women at the next level down. So we've put a concerted effort into expanding the numbers of women in our diplomatic service, particularly at the senior levels, particularly at the ambassador levels. It's not that we haven't had women, we've just not encouraged them to rise through the ranks the way we are doing now very consciously. And that's a really good thing to see too.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, you know, a large number of our trainees are young women. Many of them are school dropouts, but there are systemic reasons for that, often poverty and lack of access. And they make a very conscious choice and a leap of faith almost to leave their villages and their tribal areas to come into training with us and then to take up jobs in factories and to basically try and carve out a destiny for themselves. And in many ways, that their narrative probably resonates in a different way with, you know, women like yourselves and other women who are trying to break the ceiling or to cross over in areas where traditionally there was not so much space for them. So thank you. I especially appreciate your sharing that.
You're very welcome. And to those women, you know, they dare to dream, and I'm very impressed by them.
I hope you've had a good tour of the campus. Your parting message to our students, our trainees, our faculty, and the larger Centurion Gramtarang family?
I've been very impressed by the passion and the vision of Professor Mishra, your Centurion University's president. I think that, if anything, he sets the model. You know, it is about daring to dream. It's about having a vision and an aspiration. And I think that's where it starts. You have to have something that you aspire to, and then you have to put everything you've got into attaining that aspiration. And I really think if you have both those things, nothing can stop you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Those are very inspiring words. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. I hope so too.